The air hung thick and warm that Saturday afternoon, the kind of summer heat that makes the cicadas buzz a little louder and the iced tea disappear a little faster. We were all gathered at my sister Caroline's place for our annual summer barbecue. It's the kind of get-together that's etched into the calendar every year, a comforting rhythm of familiar faces, easy laughter, and the smell of charcoal grilling. I'm Eleanor, but most folks call me Ellie, and at 72 I've seen my fair share of these family gatherings. Caroline's backyard was always a riot of color. Blooming hydrangeas, vibrant petunias spilling out of their pots, and the lush green of the old oak tree providing a welcome patch of shade. Kids were running around, their shrieks of laughter mingling with the grown-up chatter. My husband Robert was holding court with Caroline's husband Tom near the grill, no doubt dissecting some baseball game from the week. I'd made my rounds, hugged all the nieces and nephews, and now I found myself gravitating towards the quieter corner of the garden. The garden had always been my little sanctuary. Even when the house was overflowing with people, this little patch of green felt like a world away. I loved the way the late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the worn wooden bench. I was gently deadheading some roses, the soft velvety petals a soothing contrast to the day's cheerful chaos, when I heard someone approach. "Aunt Ellie?" I turned to see Julian standing at the edge of the flower bed. Julian was Caroline's youngest, and at 24 he'd really come into his own. I still remembered him as the skinny kid with perpetually scraped knees, but now he was a handsome young man, tall and with a kind smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He'd always been a sweet boy, quiet and thoughtful. "Julian, honey, how are you doing?" I asked, setting down my gardening shears. He'd graduated from college a few months back, and I was always curious to hear about his plans. He shuffled his feet a little, a habit I remembered from his awkward teenage years. "I'm good, Aunt Ellie. Just enjoying the afternoon." We fell into a comfortable silence for a few moments, just watching the butterflies flit between the blossoms. He looked well, a little more grown up each time I saw him. There was a certain steadiness in his gaze now that hadn't been there before. I chalked it up to him finishing school and starting to figure out his path. "So," I started, wanting to break the quiet, "how's the job hunt going?" He sighed softly, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's a process. Lots of applications, lots of waiting. Don't get discouraged, sweetie. Something good will come along." I offered him a reassuring smile. We chatted for a few more minutes about his post-graduation plans, his hopes of maybe moving to the city, the usual things. But there was an undercurrent to our conversation, a subtle tension I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt like he had something else on his mind. Just as I was about to suggest we head back towards the food, Julian shifted his weight, and his voice dropped a notch. "Aunt Ellie, can I talk to you about something kind of important?" I paused, a flicker of concern in my chest. There was a seriousness in his tone that made me stop and really look at him. The easygoing smile was gone, replaced by a nervous intensity. "Of course, Julian. What's on your mind?" He looked down at the grass for a moment, then back up at me, his eyes searching mine. It's something I've been wanting to say for a while now, but I haven't really known how." He hesitated again, and I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "You can tell me anything, honey." "You know that, right?" I said gently, trying to keep my tone light and encouraging. He nodded slowly, then took a deep breath. "Aunt Ellie, it's you. I've developed feelings for you. Romantic feelings." The words hit me like a sudden gust of wind, stealing my breath. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I'd just heard. Julian, my sweet, kind young cousin, in love with me? It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, not my life. "Julian," I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. You don't know what you're saying." But he didn't back down. His gaze remained fixed on mine, filled with an earnestness that both unnerved and confused me. "I do, Aunt Ellie. I know exactly what I'm saying. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I didn't want to make things weird or uncomfortable, but I couldn't keep it inside any longer." My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, a way to dismiss this as a youthful crush, a misunderstanding. "Julian, honey, you're like family to me. You've grown up around me. This isn't right." "I know how it sounds," he said softly, but with a conviction that made my heart pound in my chest. "But I'm not a kid anymore, Aunt Ellie. I'm 24, and I know what I feel." The look in his eyes, the intensity of his confession, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't some fleeting infatuation. He meant every word. I took a step back, putting the rose bushes between us. "Julian, you have to understand. This is wrong. We're family. You're like a grandson to me. You need to move on from this, okay?" He didn't move. His expression pained. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something akin to sympathy, but I quickly pushed it down. This wasn't about my feelings. It was about stopping something that should never have started. Even as I said the words, though, I had a sinking feeling that this conversation in the garden wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. The week that followed felt strangely off-kilter. Julian, who had been a fairly regular presence in our lives, suddenly wasn't. He'd usually pop by on a Sunday afternoon to help Robert with some yard work, or just to chat, sometimes even staying for dinner. But after our conversation in the garden, his visits stopped. There were no more casual texts checking in, no impromptu calls. Part of me felt a wave of relief. I'd hoped that maybe my firm words had gotten through to him, that he was taking the space he needed to process things and move on. But there was also this quiet emptiness. It was unsettling, like a familiar piece of furniture had been removed from the room. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, focusing on my usual routines. I met up with my book club, spent an afternoon volunteering at the local animal shelter, and even went out to dinner with Robert and some friends. But no matter what I did, the memory of Julian's earnest face and his shocking confession lingered at the edges of my thoughts. Then, one Tuesday evening, as I was settling in with a cup of tea and a good book, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from Julian. My heart did a little flutter kick in my chest as I picked it up. "Aunt Ellie, can we talk? Please." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue light illuminating the lines in my hand. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to hope that if I didn't respond, the whole thing would just fade away. But another part, the part that still saw Julian as the sweet boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, felt a sense of responsibility. He was family, and even though his feelings were inappropriate, I couldn't just abandon him. Against my better judgment, I typed back a short reply. "Okay, come over tomorrow around 3 p.m. The next day crawled by. I found myself constantly checking the clock, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I tried to distract myself with chores around the house, but my mind kept drifting back to Julian, to what he might say, to what I should say. Robert was out playing golf with his buddies, so I knew I'd be facing this conversation alone. By the time 3 o'clock rolled around, I was pacing the living room, my palms slightly sweaty. Every creak of the house made me jump. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart hammered against my ribs. I took a deep breath, trying to project an air of calm as I walked to the door. This was just a conversation, I told myself, an opportunity to clear the air and help Julian understand that what he felt was something he needed to let go of. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, a different feeling washed over me. He wasn't the awkward, uncertain boy I'd spoken to in the garden. His shoulders were squared, his gaze steady, and there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made me feel a little uneasy. "Hey," I greeted him, my voice perhaps a little too breathy. "Hey, Aunt Ellie," he replied, stepping inside. His expression was unreadable, but the air between us felt thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of our last encounter. I led him into the living room, and we sat down on the sofa, a polite distance between us. The silence felt stifling, and for a moment neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Finally, Julian broke the stillness. "Aunt Ellie," he started, his voice soft but surprisingly sure, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in the garden." He paused, his gaze fixed on his hands clasped in his lap. "I've tried to forget how I feel, like you told me to, but I can't." I opened my mouth to interrupt, to say that this was still a mistake, that he needed to stop dwelling on it. But he gently raised a hand, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Please, just let me talk." Reluctantly, I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed to end this conversation before it went any further. "I know this is wrong," he continued, his gaze locking onto mine, unwavering. "I know you think I'm confused, that this is just a phase, but it's not. I've been in love with you for a long time, Aunt Ellie. This isn't something that just appeared yesterday. I've thought about it, fought against it, tried to move on, but I can't." His voice was earnest, filled with a conviction that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. My heart was racing. "Julian, you're only 24. You've just begun to live your life. These feelings, they'll change. They always do." He shook his head, his expression serious. "I'm not a child anymore, Aunt Ellie. I know what I want, and I'm not going to run from it just because it's complicated." His words stunned me. Julian had always been a mature young man, but this was different. There was a weight to his tone, a certainty that unsettled me deeply. I had expected him to be awkward and uncertain, but instead, he was calm, resolute. "This isn't just about what you want, Julian," I said, my voice firmer this time. "There's more at stake here. I'm your aunt. We're family. This can't happen." "I know it's complicated," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "But can you honestly tell me you don't feel something too?" My breath caught in my throat. For a fleeting moment I froze, unsure how to respond. That tiny pause, that brief hesitation, was enough for Julian to see right through me. "I knew it," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I saw it in the garden." "You hesitated then, just like you're hesitating now." I stood up abruptly, needing to put some space between us. "Julian, this is insane. You're my cousin. We can't do this." But instead of stepping back, he stood as well, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. "Aunt Ellie," he said, his voice low and intense, "I don't want to hurt you or make things awkward, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel, and I know you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it." My hands trembled slightly as I took another step back, the living room suddenly feeling much smaller than it had moments ago. "Julian, stop this. This isn't going to happen." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm, and I froze. There was a softness in his touch, a vulnerability that made it impossible for me to move. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Aunt Ellie," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. I needed you to know. I needed you to understand." For a long, agonizing moment, we stood there, neither of us moving, the silence between us thick with unspoken words and a confusing tangle of emotions. Then, just when I thought the tension might snap, Julian stepped back, a look of regret and something else I couldn't quite decipher in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I couldn't hold it in any longer." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions swirling in my mind. The click of the front door closing behind him echoed in the sudden silence of the house, leaving me alone with the unsettling truth that this was far from over. The following weeks were a masterclass in forced normalcy. Family gatherings became these tight, uncomfortable affairs, where Julian and I would navigate around each other like two magnets with the same polarity. We'd exchange polite nods and maybe a brief generic greeting, but that was it. Yet every stolen glance, every accidental brush of hands felt charged with an unspoken energy that I was sure everyone else could sense, even if they didn't say anything. Robert, bless his oblivious heart, just seemed to think Julian was going through a quiet phase. Caroline, however, would sometimes give me these knowing looks, a slight furrow in her brow, and I'd quickly steer the conversation to something mundane, like the weather or the state of her rose bushes. It was at another one of Caroline's infamous weekend barbecues that things took another unexpected turn. The weather was glorious, a perfect summer day with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. The usual crowd was there, spread out across the lawn, laughter echoing, the smell of burgers and hot dogs filling the air. Robert was deep in conversation with Tom again, animatedly discussing some football game I'd only half listened to. Feeling a little overwhelmed by the crowd, I slipped inside to grab a glass of iced tea, hoping for a moment of quiet in the blessedly air-conditioned kitchen. I thought I was alone, the gentle hum of the refrigerator the only sound. But as I reached into the fridge, the door creaked softly behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. It was Julian. He stood just inside the doorway, his eyes unreadable, a strange mix of longing and determination in their depths. For a split second, I considered just turning back to the fridge, pretending I hadn't seen him, but something rooted me to the spot, a strange magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Aunt Ellie, I need to talk to you." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. "Julian, now's not the time. There are people right outside." "I know, but this can't wait," he said, stepping further into the room, closing the door softly behind him. "I've tried to stay away. I've tried to forget everything that happened, but I can't." He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away, feeling the cool tile of the kitchen counter press against my spine. "Julian, we talked about this. You said you'd try to move on. What's changed?" I tried to sound firm, pretending like I didn't feel the tremor in my own voice. "It's not that easy, Aunt Ellie," he interrupted, his voice steady and unwavering. "I've thought about it every single day since that night at your house. I've been trying to figure out how to just turn it off, but nothing works. I still feel the same." A wave of panic began to rise in my chest. "You're making this harder than it has to be, Julian. You need to let this go. This isn't right." He moved closer, closing the remaining space between us, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my knees feel weak. "I don't care about what's right anymore, Aunt Ellie. I just need you to understand that I love you. I've loved you for so long, and I can't just pretend I don't." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me momentarily frozen. It was wrong, so wrong on so many levels. But the raw emotion in his voice, the sheer vulnerability in his eyes, made it hard to think clearly. My thoughts were spinning, my chest tight with a weight of emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. "Julian, stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You have to stop this." "Stop." I told him to stop, partly to stop him, but mostly to stop myself from what? From letting go? From admitting the confusing stirrings within me? "I can't," he replied softly, his gaze searching mine. I don't want to hurt you, Aunt Ellie, but I can't control how I feel. He reached out a hand, his fingertips brushing mine gently. I pulled back slightly, flinching at the unexpected contact, but the warmth of his touch lingered, sending a wave of unsettling uncertainty through me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be happening. You don't have to say anything, he said, stepping even closer, his voice now a low murmur. I closed my eyes, trying to block out his words, the closeness, the confusing memories that were threatening to surface. Just no. Julian, please, I started, but as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew this conversation wasn't going the way I hoped. The air between us felt charged, drawing us closer in a way that both terrified and intrigued me. Just as I was about to speak again, the sound of the back door creaking open cut through the tense silence, startling both of us. Ellie? You in here? It was Caroline's voice, calling from the hallway. A surge of panic shot through me. I quickly moved away from Julian, putting as much space between us as I could before Caroline appeared in the doorway, a cheerful smile on her face. Ah, there you are. Robert was looking for you outside. She glanced from me to Julian, her smile faltering slightly as she seemed to sense the sudden tension in the room. Everything okay in here? Yeah, fine, I replied quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the iced tea in the fridge. Just talking about college, Julian's plans for the fall, or Caroline's eyes flicked between Julian and me, a hint of suspicion in their depths, but she didn't press further. All right, well, don't keep Robert waiting. She gave us both a quick, almost questioning look before heading back outside. Julian remained silent, his eyes locked on me with an intensity that made me feel like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. Part of me didn't want to leave, wanted to stay and finally confront the confusing emotions that were swirling between us, but I knew I couldn't. Not like this. Without saying another word, I followed Caroline out into the yard, trying to push the entire exchange from my mind. But deep down, I knew things between Julian and me were far from over, and our story was still very much unfinished. The next few days were a blur. My mind felt foggy, unable to focus on much beyond the unsettling encounters with Julian. His words kept echoing in my head, and each time I thought about how close we had been to something I wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, a wave of nausea would wash over me. I knew I had to put an end to this, to set a firm boundary, but every time I tried to formulate the right words, they seemed to slip away from me. Then one night, as I lay next to Robert, his breathing deep and even in sleep, I heard the soft ping of my phone. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, my heart already starting to race. The message was from Julian. We need to talk. I can't keep going like this. Tomorrow at your place, 3 p.m. Please. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, torn between fear and a reluctant sense of responsibility. I knew I shouldn't meet him again. Being alone with him would only lead to more complications, more confusion. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't, this situation would just continue to fester, unresolved. With a sigh, I typed back a single word. Okay. The next day, just before 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My hands were clammy, my pulse racing as I peered through the peephole. It was Julian. He stood on my porch, looking tense, his shoulders slightly hunched as he stared out at the quiet street. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever conversation lay ahead, and opened the door. There he was, young, vibrant, and undeniably handsome. Hey, I said softly, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. Hey, Aunt Ellie, he replied, stepping inside. Immediately, the air in the hallway felt thick, charged with all the unspoken words that hung between us. The weight of our previous encounters pressed down on us both. "I can't do this anymore, Aunt Ellie," Julian finally said, breaking the strained silence. "I can't keep pretending I'm fine, like I can just move on and forget everything." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Julian, I know this is hard for you, but we have to move on. We can't stay stuck in this place. It's not good for either of us." He shook his head, a flash of frustration and pain in his eyes. "You don't understand. I can't just turn off my feelings. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried, and I don't think you can either." I turned my gaze away, unable to meet his intense stare. "I'm your Aunt, Julian. We're family," I said, reciting the mantra I'd repeated to myself countless times. "What you're feeling, it's not something we can act on. It's not just about us. It's about everyone else, too. We would destroy so much if we crossed that line." He shifted his weight, his voice softening slightly, but still laced with a stubborn resolve. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong. But I can't keep lying to myself." His words hung in the air between us, and a wave of panic surged within me. I knew I needed to make him understand once and for all that this had to end. We both sat down on the sofa, the familiar cushions feeling strangely foreign beneath me. "Julian, listen to me," I said, turning to face him directly. "I care about you deeply. I love you, but not in the way you want. You have to let this go, for your own good." He looked at me, his expression softening just a little, and for a fleeting moment I saw the vulnerable boy I had known all his life, the one who had always looked up to me and sought my advice. "Tell me you didn't feel anything, Aunt Ellie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me you didn't feel anything that night in the kitchen, that day in the garden, and I'll let this go." The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. I wanted to give him the answer that would slam the door shut on this whole mess, but the truth caught in my throat like a heavy stone. I had felt something, a confusing mix of shock, surprise, and, yes, a flicker of something else, something I couldn't quite explain, something I didn't want to admit to myself, but I couldn't let that truth escape. It would only make everything worse. I wanted to lie, to deny it all, but before I knew it, the words spilled out, barely a whisper. "If I'm honest, I did feel something, Julian." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. His face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to push further. But then, slowly, he nodded, his eyes filled with a deep longing, a yearning to return to those brief moments of charged connection. And suddenly I felt it too. That same pull, that same dangerous curiosity. I knew I was the one in control, the one who needed to end this. But in that moment, something shifted. I leaned towards him, reached out, took his chin in my hand and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, a soft exploration, but in that instant the dam broke. All the unspoken desires, the confusing emotions, the forbidden attraction surged to the surface. This time, neither of us held back. We gave in completely. As my hand found its way to the back of his neck, his arms wrapping around my waist, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a thrilling mix of wrongness and undeniable excitement. It was a wild, reckless moment, and looking back, it's all a bit of a blur of tangled limbs and whispered breaths. Eventually, when we were both lying back against the cushions, slightly disheveled and breathing heavily, the reality of what had just happened crashed down on me like a ton of bricks. "Julian," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "this was a huge mistake, a massive mistake. We can't ever tell anyone about this." He looked at me, his eyes still filled with a lingering tenderness but also a hint of hurt. "But Aunt Ellie," he whispered, reaching for my hand, I truly love you. I want more of this." I pulled my hand away gently, my heart aching with a confusing mix of guilt and a strange, undeniable thrill. "No, Julian, no. This can't happen again. I don't want more of this." I stood up, my legs feeling a little shaky, and started to straighten my clothes, the simple act feeling incredibly significant. "Okay," he whispered, his voice laced with resignation, "if that's how you feel." He turned away from me, walking a few steps towards the window, his back to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything he had been carrying, and now the weight of my rejection. I wanted to go to him, to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew I couldn't. Any physical touch, any further words of solace might be misconstrued, might reignite the dangerous spark that had just flared between us. This was something he had to come to terms with on his own. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sounds of laughter from the ongoing barbecue at Caroline's. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice low and resigned. I'll move on, Aunt Ellie. I'll try anyway, but I don't know how long it's going to take." I nodded, my heart heavy with guilt and a strange sense of relief. "You'll get through this, Julian. You're strong. You'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved." He didn't respond, just stood there, staring out at the water feature in my backyard, lost in his thoughts. I waited a moment longer, unsure of what else to say, before I turned to leave the living room. I needed to put some distance between us, to try and regain some semblance of normalcy. But just as I started to walk away, I heard him speak one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper, filled with a heartbreaking sincerity. "I'll always love you, Aunt Ellie." Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I walked out of the living room, leaving Julian standing by the window, his silhouette framed against the late afternoon light. I knew in that moment that we had both crossed a line, ventured into a territory that would forever alter the landscape of our relationship in ways neither of us would ever fully understand.